Okay, we begin part two of our discussion of Hume on causation with me recognizing that I omitted something from part one. I referenced Pavlov's dogs, but I didn't explain what the hell I was talking about. This is a pretty well known experiment. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. The experimenter fed dogs and then had a bell ring as they were being fed. He does this over and over and over, and then establishes that the dogs salivate when they hear a bell. Their minds have forged a connection between events. There is no physical connection out in the world. It's only the experimenter deciding, somewhat arbitrarily, to correlate food and the sound of a bell. But the dogs associate, because of habit and repetition, those two stimuli. Hume thinks that's how causation works even for talky creatures like us. We don't have any experience of something out in the world connecting the cause and the effect. The connection is in our minds. And so even though Hume's work predates Pavlov's, Pavlov is a nice example of how Hume thinks causation works. Remember from the preceding lecture here, this is an empiricist semantic account. What causation means has to be traced back to its basis or grounding in experience. So in the second part, we see Hume trying to develop a positive account of causation given this empiricist semantic account. He gives two answers to this question, which he regards as equivalent. Nobody but Hume seems to regard them as equivalent, so he pretty clearly made a mistake here. We're going to give the two accounts, then talk about some preliminaries about causation, and then show their non-equivalency. The first account is a regularity account or a pattern account. To say that A causes B is to say that we've had lots of experiences of A-type events being followed by B-type events and no experience of A-type events not being followed by B-type events. So whenever cue balls hit 8 balls move. Whenever billiard balls hit one another, the one that is hit moves. Were there significant exceptions, then we start to have doubts about the causal claim. So on a regularity account, to say that A causes B is to make appeal to an exceptionless pattern in experience. The other account, which most people regard as a competitor, but Hume seems to regard as equivalent, is a counterfactual account. Counterfactual is a philosopher's word. It's short for contrary to fact conditional. That's about how things would have been had things been different. So on this account, to say that A causes B is to say that if A hadn't happened, B wouldn't have happened. Had the cue ball not hit the 8 ball, the 8 ball wouldn't have moved. So our first preliminary is to talk about counterfactuals and experience. We often treat counterfactuals as if they're kind of BS, that they're a sort of indirect way of people expressing their preferences or biases or something like that. So maybe a classic example of counterfactual reasoning would be somebody saying, well, a certain smaller number of people would have died from COVID-19 had Hillary Clinton been president rather than Donald Trump being president. That might be true, it might not, it's awfully complicated. I don't want to get into complicated questions because the point I want to make is a simple one. We seem to credit ourselves with lots of knowledge of counterfactuals even though we don't experience counterfactuals. Right now I am holding an Apple Pencil that I am using to try to keep you slightly visually engaged as we work through these ideas. Were I to drop this Apple Pencil, which I ain't gonna drop, I know what would happen, even though I will never have the experience of dropping my Apple Pencil during this lecture. You know what would happen were you to turn the light switch on in your room. If the lights are not on, they would come on. If they're on, they would go off, right? So we have lots and lots of knowledge about things we don't experience. So we think that experience puts us in a position to tell what would happen if things were different. And this puts pressure on a Humean idea of tracing everything back to experience. It's also closely connected to some worries about laws of nature that we'll talk about a little later. So a counterfactual, like if this piece of chalk were made of metal, it would conduct electricity. That's something we think science puts us in a position to assert. But that looks like it's helping itself to an unhuman idea about being metallic, making things be conductive. And Hume's whole point is we don't have any experience of making, of forcing, of necessary connection, of what has to happen. We only have experience of what does happen. But we think science can tell us an awful lot about what would happen if things were different, or about what has to happen under certain circumstances. And so this is the great challenge for Humean approaches. They have this tempting feature of trying to trace everything in science back to experience. But the ambitions of science, and some of the ambitions seem to be delivered on, look like they go way beyond experience. Experience is just of what does happen. We think science can tell us about what has to happen. We think science can tell us about what would have happened had things been different. We'll explore that more as we get into regularity and counterfactual models, but I first want to address a kind of ill-formed partial sense about causation that many people have. I think people who are untutored philosophically picture causation as some kind of juice or momentum that gets transferred from the cause to the effect, that it's a physical thing that the cause imparts to the effect, sort of like the motion of your arm imparts impetus on Buridan's theory. This is the kind of thing that Newton's critics seem to want from his account of gravity, right? You can't just say the moon pulls on the earth and the earth pulls on the moon. Tell us what the mechanical model is. Tell us how this force is transmitted. As we're going to see at the end of this lecture, this is the kind of thing Hume is trying to defend Newton against. In ordinary usage, causation is much broader than some kind of mechanical transfer of something. The NRA used to have an ad campaign saying guns don't kill people, people kill people. But it's probably not guns that typically kill people. It's something closer to bullets. And it's not even clear that bullets kill people. More directly, it's an absence. It's lack of oxygen getting to the brain that causes death. But an absence is not some kind of momentum or physical stuff that gets transmitted from the cause to the effect. Similarly, we might think that Socrates' death causes Xanthippe to be a widow, but that's instantaneous causation. It's faster than the speed of light. The very moment Socrates dies, Xanthippe is at that instant widowed. And so it doesn't seem like there's any kind of physical process. On a regularity view, causation is really a logical relationship. It's about the status of something as a kind of permanent necessary condition for something else of a different description. I'll explain that in a second. But the heart of the matter is, on a regularity view, which fits Hume's empiricism very well, regularity views are patterns, and we do have patterns in experience. We just don't have makings in experience. And so on a view like that, there's something about the logical relationship that the cause has to bear to the effect. Causation is close to explanation rather than something like momentum or juice. So a regularity view is going to need to be made fancier than we're going to bother doing in a 100 level class, because there's so many different kinds of patterns in experience. Roughly, though, on a view like this, a cause is a necessary part of a sufficient package for the effect. Suppose you unwisely leave a candle burning in your dorm room or apartment and you burn the building down. There's a pattern of unsupervised flames leading to deadly fires, but there's also a pattern of oxygen in the air preceding deadly fires. And so on a regularity view, both of those are causes, because whenever there's an open flame and oxygen and flammable material, etc., all of those together are a sufficient package. Each of the components is a necessary part of that sufficient package. Your landlord and your landlord's insurance company are going to pick out, for purposes of assigning responsibility, you're leaving a flame unsupervised rather than the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere. But logically speaking, on a regularity view, there is this connection, a logical connection, a repetition, a pattern of oxygen being present when flames catch. Similarly, on a counterfactual view, if there hadn't been oxygen in the room, your leaving an unsupervised flame would not have brought about the fire. So, on a counterfactual analysis, the connection between the cause and the effect is metaphysical, not physical as it is on the momentum or juice view, and not logical as it is on the regularity view. On a counterfactual analysis, it's whatever makes it the case that this is how things would have happened had things gone differently. So you're going to say to your landlord, yeah, if I had kept an eye on the candle I left burning, the fire wouldn't have happened. But also, if there had been no oxygen in the room, the fire wouldn't have happened. And the landlord's going to say one of those is much more controllable and avoidable than the other. All right, now to establish the non-equivalence of these two accounts of causation, we can go to something like causal overdetermination. When execution by firing squad happens, at least I am told, there are several sharpshooters, one of whom is shooting blanks. That's supposed to, in part, be for the well-being of the executioners. They'll never know whether they shot an actual bullet or a blank. But let's say the condemned is hit by multiple bullets, as is the idea when one faces a firing squad. On a simple regularity view, everybody who shoots is a cause of death. Whenever you are shot in the heart by a sharpshooter, you die. So on a regularity view, there's an exceptionless pattern between facing a firing squad of very competent riflemen and dying. On a simple counterfactual view, let's focus on there just being two sharpshooters rather than a whole panel, and let's leave blanks aside. On a simple counterfactual view, neither sharpshooter killed the victim. Why? Because if sharpshooter A hadn't shot, would the victim still have died? Yes, because sharpshooter B shot. And if sharpshooter B hadn't shot, would the victim still have died? Yes, because sharpshooter A would have shot. And so, in cases of causal overdetermination, regularity views seem to make it perhaps excessively easy to be a cause, and simple counterfactual views tend to make it especially hard to be a cause. Similar things are going to happen in cases of causal preemption. I mentioned Jones here in my notes, but I'm going to try to keep you awake and give you a more vivid example. I am not advocating violence against the current president of the United States or anybody else. I'm just giving you an example. So let's say that both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris decide they're going to kill Donald Trump. Biden poisons Trump with a pound of arsenic. Kamala Harris gets a bus to run Trump over. So Trump has ingested the arsenic. I don't know how Biden got him to eat a pound of arsenic, but let's say he did. But Kamala runs him over before the arsenic can take effect. On a simple regularity view, both Biden and Harris killed Trump. Why? Because whenever you ingest a pound of arsenic, you die. Whenever you are hit sufficiently hard by a bus, you die. On a simple counterfactual view again, neither Biden nor Harris killed Trump. Why? Because if Biden hadn't poisoned Trump, he'd still be dead. And if Harris hadn't run Trump over, he'd still be dead. So a regularity view and a counterfactual view are not, contrary to what Hume says, equivalent. Both have problems. The philosophy of causation is something we could spend a whole semester on. Let me connect Hume to Newton here. And again, for philosophy majors, this is going to show you how Hume looks different when you connect him to the history of science, not just the history of philosophy. People like Leibniz wanted a mechanism from Newton. How does gravity work? What Hume's doing is showing you that all forces, even what contact forces like billiard balls, are mysterious in the way Newtonian gravity is. Leibniz wanted a rope, something like a rope, to explain how the moon tugs on the earth and the earth tugs on the moon. Hume says even when you've got a rope, all you can say is whenever there's this sort of contact, these things affect each other. So what Hume is doing is making all forces as mysterious as Newtonian gravity is. We can never say that contact makes things move, just as we can't say that gravity makes things move. We don't know how any of this works. All we have are patterns. Whenever they're the right sort of contacts, there are changes in motion. Whenever objects are close enough, there are changes in motion brought about by gravity. So what Hume is doing is taking what had seemed like a weak spot in the Newtonian view, the inability to tell you how gravity works, what makes it happen. And Hume says Newton's gravity is no worse off than any force. We never know how forces work. We never have any experience about what makes something happen. And so arguably that idea that science is a matter of tracing back to the most fundamental patterns in experience and leaving those unexplained. That's what a consistent inductivist empiricism should do. Whenever things are close to each other, they pull with a force of this magnitude. Whenever things touch each other, they move in the following sort of way, without any attempt to explain what makes these things happen. We will connect this up to Hume's very famous argument that you don't know that the sun is going to come up tomorrow. That will be the in-class lecture for this week. Thanks as always for your time and attention.